In the Game of Thrones, there are two ways to die: by the sword of an enemy or by the smile of a friend. For King Alistair, the deadliest poison was not found in his wine, but in a kiss, but in a palace where every courtier is a viper and every shadow holds a lie. Who do you trust when the king himself lies dead and the doors are sealed from the outside? The first sign of ruin was not a clash of steel, but a single piercing scream from a chambermaid. Captain Valerius of the Royal Guard was the first to arrive. He found the king not in his bed, but slumped in the high-backed chair by the hearth, a goblet of dark wine spilled across the stone floor like a pool of blood. Alistair's eyes were open, his lips slightly parted, not in pain but in faint surprise, as if his death had been a shocking breach of etiquette. It was the peaceful, terrible death of a man who had implicitly trusted his own murderer. Queen Elara arrived moments later, a vision of composure in silk and shadow. She did not gasp or weep. Her gaze took in the scene with an unnerving stillness, her first words not of grief, but of strategy. "The Eastern envoys," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "They must not learn of this, not until we have control." Her cold pragmatism hung in the air, a silent accusation in itself. Was this the reaction of a grieving wife, or a political player whose inconvenient husband had just been removed from the board? Lord Gideon, the king's chief adviser, was next, his face a perfect mask of sorrow, but his eyes already darting around the room, assessing the new landscape of power. "A monstrous act," he declared, his voice resonating with false grief. "This is an attack on the very heart of our kingdom. We must seal the palace. The killer is among us, and they will not escape." It was a sensible command, yet it also served to trap every key player in his immediate vicinity. Then came Duke Gareth, the king's younger brother, his face pale with shock that quickly curdled into a familiar, simmering rage. "Who would dare?" he bellowed, his fist clenched. But his fury seemed directed less at the loss of his brother and more at the audacious insult to their family's authority. The final arrival was a storm of emotion. Princess Lyra, the king's cherished younger sister, burst into the room and collapsed beside Alistair's chair, her sobs echoing in the dreadful silence. She was the very picture of devastation, a stark and accusing contrast to the queen's icy calm. But as her tear-filled eyes met Ilara's across the body of the dead king, a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred passed between them. In that moment, the trap was sprung. The palace was sealed, the game was afoot, and in that gilded cage of whispering corridors and shadowed thrones, every soul was now a suspect. The palace, once a place of shimmering life, had become a mausoleum overnight. Every exit was sealed, every corridor patrolled by the stoic, iron-faced royal guard. Captain Valerius began his grim task, navigating a sea of whispers and veiled accusations. His loyalty was to the truth, a commodity more precious and far rarer than gold within these walls. He started with the queen. He found Elara in her solar, not weeping, but staring out at the manicured gardens, her hands clasped behind her back. She seemed more like a general surveying a battlefield than a grieving widow. Her alibi was pristine in its simplicity. She had been alone, reading, awaiting the king's summons after his meeting. She answered Valerius's questions with a chilling precision, her voice never wavering. She spoke of Alistair not as a husband or a lover, but as a political partner, a colleague. "His death complicates the signing of the Eastern Treaty," she stated, her tone analytical. "The stability of the realm was his foremost concern. It must now be ours." Valerius, a man trained to read the slightest flicker of deceit, found none. What he found was a chilling absence of emotion, a void where grief should have been. It was a coldness so profound it could be mistaken for guilt, and he knew every other lord in the palace would make that exact assumption. Lord Gideon was already one step ahead. He found Valerius in the hall, his face a perfect sculpture of concern. "A terrible business, Captain," he began, his voice low and conspiratorial. The Queen. She is a strong woman, but this tragedy, it would break anyone. And the King's well-known indiscretions. They must have placed a terrible strain on her heart. It was a masterclass in manipulation. He wasn't accusing the Queen directly. He was merely painting a picture, planting a seed. The scorned, jealous wife. It was the oldest motive in the world. He then departed to convene an emergency session of the Privy Council, speaking of the need for a firm hand to guide the kingdom through the crisis. He argued that Duke Gareth was too emotional, too rash to be trusted with the regency. With the Queen clearly unstable, the only logical choice, he humbly offered, was a council of advisers. A council led, of course, by himself. He was not just investigating a murder, he was orchestrating a coup, using the king's corpse as his stepping stone to the throne. Elsewhere, the royal siblings were forging an alliance in venom. Duke Gareth found Princess Lyra in the royal chapel, her sobs having subsided into a simmering, hateful silence. "A king murdered in his own keep!" Gareth seethed, his voice echoing off the stained glass. "By the gods, it makes our house look weak." Lyra looked up, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "It wasn't a stranger who did this," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "It was her, the northern witch. She never loved him. She felt nothing for him but contempt. He told me so himself." The words hung in the air, a confession of an intimacy that went far beyond that of a brother and sister. Gareth, however, was too consumed by his own ambition to notice. "The crown should have been mine from the start," he confessed, a lifetime of resentment pouring out. "Father knew I had the strength to rule, while Alistair only had the charm." He saw his brother's death not as a loss, but as a long overdue opportunity. And in his sister's fierce, consuming hatred for the Queen, he saw the perfect weapon to help him seize it. But they all underestimated the woman they sought to isolate. Confined to her chambers for her own protection, a gilded prison sentence ordered by Gideon's council, Ilara was anything but idle. She knew they were all moving against her, their lies circling like vultures. She had to break the siege. She summoned her youngest and most trusted lady-in-waiting, Anya, a girl so quiet she moved through the palace like a ghost. "They think I am trapped," Ilara whispered, pressing a small, tightly rolled parchment into the girl's hand. It was a message, written in a complex code only her family would understand. "This cannot fall into the wrong hands. It must reach the master of the rookery. Tell him the grey hawk flies north at dusk. It must not fail." The message was a desperate gambit. It was a plea for help to the only person in the world she knew she could trust. Her father, the formidable king of the northern mountains. She was no longer just a suspect in a murder. She was now a player in a war, and she had just summoned an army. Ilara knew that surviving until her father's army could be mustered was not a matter of days, but of hours. Locked away, she was a queen with no power, only a brilliant mind and one terrified but loyal ally. She summoned Anya again, her whisper a current of icy resolve in the cold stone room. "Grief makes people careless," Ilara began, her eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight coming through the barred window. "And hatred makes them predictable. Lyra's hatred is a fire. It burns hot and bright, but it is not subtle. The poison that killed the king, however, was a courtier's weapon. It was elegant, quiet, and difficult to trace." She then laid out a plan, born from years of lonely observation. "The royal apothecary, Master Hemlock, is a man who prizes his own skin above any king's. He is meticulous. For his private sales, he keeps a separate ledger. It is not in his official dispensary. It is in his personal quarters, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Gillyweed and its Applications." She described the exact location on the bookshelf, the feel of the false cover, the scent of dried lavender he used to mask the book's age. This was the knowledge of a woman who had spent years reading, watching, and understanding the secret mechanisms of the palace, while everyone else had dismissed her as a decorative piece of a political treaty. Anya's mission was a descent into a serpent's den, The palace after dark was a place of heightened paranoia, with guards at every corner and suspicious eyes peering from every doorway. To reach the apothecary's quarters, she had to navigate the servants' passages, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She moved like the ghost Ilara had called her, a shadow slipping through other shadows. The apothecary's door was unlocked, an act of supreme arrogance. Inside, the air was thick with the cloying scent of 100 different herbs. Anya's hands trembled as she scanned the bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of the ancient books. She found it, the book on gillyweed. Just as the queen had described, the back of it was hollow, and inside, a small leather-bound ledger. She didn't dare take it. Instead, she quickly scanned the last few pages, her mind racing to memorize the script. There it was, dated just a week prior. A coded entry, but its meaning was unmistakable. One vial, Winter's kiss, for the princess, payment in silver. Winter's kiss. A poison so potent it mimicked a sudden peaceful failure of the heart. Anya had her proof. Lyra, the grieving sister, had purchased the means to kill the king. But as she was about to close the ledger, her eyes caught another entry, scrawled hastily at the bottom of the page. It was dated the very afternoon of the king's murder. The script was the same, but shakier, as if written in a great hurry. It recorded the sale of a different substance, not a poison, but a powerful, fast-acting soporific, a sleeping draught strong enough to fell a warhorse. The purchaser was not the princess. It was Lord Gideon. Anya brought the two pieces of information back to Ilara, her mind reeling, unable to see the connection. But Ilara, sitting in the darkness of her cell, saw it instantly. The labyrinth of lies opened up before her, and the truth was more monstrous than she could have ever imagined. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a tomb door slamming shut. Lyra, in a fit of passionate, jealous rage, had bought the poison to murder her. The plan was simple, hateful, and born of a lover's scorn. She was meant to be the victim, but Gideon, the master puppeteer, must have learned of the plot. He saw an opportunity not just to eliminate a rival, but to reshape the entire kingdom. He acquired the sedative. He must have drugged the king, incapacitating him. Then he likely stole the poison Lyra had purchased and administered it to the helpless monarch himself. The genius of his plan was its devastating cruelty. He had used Lyra's simple, hateful plot as the perfect cover for his own. He would let her crime be discovered, painting her as a madwoman and a regicide. He would use the chaos to brand Ilara as unstable. With both the queen and the princess eliminated from the game, he would be free to install the pliable Duke Gareth on the throne and rule as the undisputed power in the realm. She was never just a suspect in a murder investigation. She was the intended victim of one plot and the designated pawn in another, far deadlier one. The knowledge of Gideon's treachery did not bring despair. It brought a terrifying calm. Sitting on the cold stone floor of her cell, Ilara finally saw the entire board, every piece, every move, every possible outcome. The grief for her husband was a distant echo, replaced by the crystal-clear understanding of the serpent that had coiled itself around the throne. She saw the easy path laid before her, use Anya's discovery to expose Lyra. The princess, a known lover with a motive and the means, would be the perfect, simple solution. It would save Ilara's life, and the council would praise her for uncovering the truth. But it would also be a lie. It would be a surrender to Gideon's grander design, leaving the true killer in absolute power. Ilara looked at her reflection in a small puddle of water on the floor. The woman staring back was not a wife fighting for her life. She was a queen fighting for her kingdom. Letting the wolf devour the jackal was not justice. It was merely a change of predators. She resolved, in that silent, dripping darkness, to hunt them both. Her first move was not one of force, but of insidious poison, a tactic she had learned from Gideon himself. She requested a final meeting with her sister-in-law, a plea to make peace with her family before her execution. Gideon, seeing this as the final, pathetic act of a broken woman, and eager for Lyra to further cement the image of the grieving victim, granted it immediately. The two women met in a small, heavily guarded chamber. Lyra came expecting tears and apologies. She found a conspirator. Ilara's voice was a sympathetic whisper. "I know why you did it, Lyra," she began, feigning an understanding that chilled the princess to the bone. "You loved him. You wanted to free him from a loveless marriage, but you were a fool to trust Gideon." Lyra's face hardened. "Gideon is a loyal servant of the crown." Ilara let out a small, bitter laugh. "Gideon is a loyal servant of Gideon. Did you really think he would let you, a woman ruled by passion, have any real power? I heard him with the Duke. They were discussing your future after I am gone. They spoke of your instability. They planned to have you declared mentally unfit, marry you off to some northern brute to secure a new alliance, and send you into a gilded exile 1,000 miles from here. You were never his partner, Lyra. You were just the first part of his plan." Every word was a lie, a carefully crafted fiction designed to prey on Lyra's deepest insecurities. She watched the princess's face crumble, the righteous fury replaced by a dawning, paranoid horror. Ilara had not gained an ally, but she had successfully lit a fire in Gideon's own camp. She had turned his most valuable asset into an unpredictable, terrified liability. Her second move was for the only man in the palace she believed might still serve the truth, Captain Valerius. She could not send him evidence. It would be dismissed as a forgery from a desperate woman. She had to give him a thread, a single, undeniable fact that would force him to pull on it until the entire conspiracy unraveled. She gave Anya a new message, a simple parchment with a single cryptic question. Anya, proving her worth, managed to slip it into the captain's gauntlet as he oversaw the changing of the guard. Later, in the privacy of his office, Valerius unrolled it. It contained one sentence: "Ask the royal physician why a sleeping draught, strong enough to fell a horse, was delivered to the king's chambers on the night he died." Valerius froze. The question was a bomb thrown into the center of his investigation. The narrative he was being fed by Gideon was one of a simple crime of passion, a jealous lover, a vial of poison. But a powerful sedative? That spoke of a different kind of crime. It suggested a level of planning, of cold, calculated precision that did not fit the profile of the hysterical, grieving princess. A sedative implied the king was incapacitated before he was poisoned. It was the work of an assassin, not a lover. It was a single, discordant note in Gideon's perfectly orchestrated symphony, and Valerius, a man who believed in order, could not ignore it. Ilara had not given him an accusation. She had given him a path, and she knew his rigid devotion to duty would force him to walk it. Back in her cell, Ilara waited. The raven was flying north. Lyra was a poisoned chalice waiting to be spilled, and Valerius was now following a trail of breadcrumbs that would lead him directly to the wolf's door. Gideon believed he was the master of the game, a king moving his pieces across the board. He had never considered that the board itself was the prison, and that a condemned queen, from a cell 100 feet below, was the one truly in control of the game. The seeds of chaos Ilara had planted began to bear bitter fruit. In Lord Gideon's study, the fragile alliance of conspirators shattered. Princess Lyra, driven mad by Ilara's poisonous whispers and the terror of her own guilt, stormed into the room, her eyes wild. "You meant to betray me!" she shrieked at Gideon, her voice a raw, ragged thing. "You were going to send me away. She told me everything." Gideon, caught completely off guard by her hysterical outburst, tried to placate her with his usual smooth reassurances, but his words were like oil on a raging fire. "You used me!" Lyra screamed, her control completely gone. "You used my love for him to get what you wanted." Duke Gareth, drawn by the commotion, entered the study just in time to hear his sister's confession boil over. "I did it for him," she sobbed, turning her tear-streaked face to her uncle. "I bought the poison, yes, but it was to free him from her, to free him from that cold, barren witch, so we could finally be together." The admission hung in the air, a death sentence spoken from her own lips. Gareth stared, his ambition momentarily forgotten, replaced by a look of genuine shock and disgust. Gideon's face was a mask of cold fury. His perfect pawn had just confessed to attempted murder in front of the one man he needed to control. The internal rupture was complete. His conspiracy was bleeding out on his own study floor. Meanwhile, Captain Valerius pulled on the thread he had been given, and the tapestry of lies began to unravel. He did not go to the apothecary himself. That would be too obvious. He sent 2 of his most trusted men to secure all medical records for the investigation, a move Gideon could not block without looking guilty. In the privacy of his office, Valerius found what he was looking for: the apothecary's private ledger, obtained with a pressure that left no marks. And just as the Queen's message had hinted, he found more. He confronted the royal physician, a nervous, sweating man who folded under the captain's cold, unwavering stare. He confessed to providing Lord Gideon with a powerful sedative, enough to incapacitate a man for hours, under the flimsy pretext that it was for a rabid hunting dog. The timeline was damning. Gideon had acquired the sedative on the very day Lyra planned to use her poison. The picture was becoming brutally clear. This was not one crime, but 2, layered on top of each other like a funeral shroud. Armed with this knowledge, Valerius sought out Lord Gideon in the Great Hall. He did not come with accusations, but with quiet, lethal facts. "My lord," he said, his voice level, "the investigation has presented a conundrum. The evidence suggests the princess intended a crime of passion, yet the physician's records show the king was sedated with a draught you personally ordered. A simple murder has become complex. One might suspect there was more than one hunter in the woods that night." Gideon's face, for the first time since the king's death, lost its mask of control. He saw the trap. He tried to dismiss Valerius, to accuse him of acting on the ravings of a condemned woman, but the captain stood his ground, an immovable wall of duty. "I serve the truth, my lord," Valerius said, "and the truth is beginning to reveal itself." The palace was a powder keg, and news of the confrontations was the spark. Whispers turned to panicked accusations. Gideon's allies began to distance themselves, smelling the stench of a failed coup. With her enemies in disarray, Ilara made her final move from the shadows. Through Anya, she sent not a secret message, but a formal decree sealed with the Queen Regent's authority. She summoned an emergency session of the full Royal Council to be held at midday. The summons declared that Captain Valerius had uncovered irrefutable evidence of a wide-ranging conspiracy of treason, and that all members were required to attend to hear his findings and pass judgment. It was a masterstroke. She was no longer the accused. She had seized control of the narrative, using the very council Gideon had weaponized against her as her own stage. Moments before the council was to convene, Valerius personally walked to the dungeons. He did not send a guard. He unlocked Ilara's cell himself. "Your Majesty," he said with a formal bow, "your presence is required. The council is waiting." Ilara emerged, not in the rags of a prisoner, but in a gown of deep crimson, the color of her house, the color of blood, the color of war. The rupture was complete. The final confrontation was about to begin. The Great Hall was not a court of law. It was a battlefield awaiting the first charge. The air was thick with fear and ambition. Every great lord and lady of the realm was present, trapped by the Queen's summons, forced to declare their allegiance. Lord Gideon stood with his faction, his face a pale mask of confidence, but his eyes darted nervously towards the exits. Duke Gareth stood apart, a man caught between his own ambition and the sickening truth of his family's treachery. They all watched the empty king's throne, the symbol of the power that was now up for grabs. Then the heavy oak doors swung open. Ilara entered. The crimson of her gown was a slash of fresh blood against the hall's grey tapestries. She did not take the seat of a grieving consort. She ascended the dais and, with a calm, deliberate grace, took her place on the regent's throne, a seat of power she had never been permitted to occupy while her husband lived. A collective gasp went through the chamber. It was a silent, profound declaration of war. "My lords," she began, her voice resonating with a power no one had ever heard from her before. "We are gathered to address the murder of my husband, King Alistair. There has been much speculation, much fear. It is time for the truth." She turned her gaze to the captain of the Royal Guard. "Captain Valerius, your report." Valerius stepped forward, his face impassive, his loyalty now pledged to the evidence he had uncovered. He spoke with the cold, factual precision of a soldier. He first presented the apothecary's ledger, detailing Princess Lyra's purchase of the Winter's Kiss poison. A wave of murmurs swept the room. Gideon allowed himself a small, predatory smile, believing the blame would fall neatly on the hysterical princess. But Valerius was not finished. He then presented the royal physician's sworn testimony, confirming that the king had been heavily sedated moments before his death. And then the final damning piece of evidence, the order for that sedative, signed and sealed by Lord Gideon himself. The hall erupted. Gideon shot to his feet, his voice booming. "This is an outrage, a fabrication, the ravings of a grieving queen being manipulated by an overzealous guard." But his protest was drowned out by a new voice. Lord Brynmore, the Master of Coin, who had been a quiet supporter of Gideon, now stood. "I will not be silent while this man accuses others of the very treason he has committed," Brynmore declared, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and newfound courage. "Lord Gideon promised many of us positions of power in a new council. He spoke of the Queen's instability and the Duke's rashness, leaving only one man to benefit from this tragedy, himself." The dam of lies broke. Other lords, who had been swayed by Gideon's promises, now saw the trap they had nearly walked into. They turned on him, their accusations flying like arrows, each one seeking to distance themselves from a losing side. Gideon's carefully constructed pyramid of power crumbled into dust in a matter of moments. Duke Gareth, seeing his ambitions evaporate, fell to his knees, professing his ignorance of the murder plot, claiming he had been a pawn of Gideon's ambition. He begged the Queen for mercy. The political war was over before a single sword had been drawn. Throughout the chaos, Ilara remained still, watching the vipers devour each other. When the hall finally fell into an expectant silence, all eyes turned to her on the throne. She stood, the Crimson Queen, the silent arbiter of their fates. Her voice did not need to be loud to be heard in every corner of the room. "The evidence is clear," she stated. "The treason is absolute. The war for the throne was over, and a new, more formidable reign was about to begin." Ilara's gaze swept across the silent, terrified faces of the council. There was no triumph in her eyes, only the cold, hard light of necessity. Her judgments began, each sentence delivered with the force of a hammer blow shaping a new era. She turned first to Duke Gareth, who was still kneeling, a pathetic figure of ambition turned to ash. "My Lord Gareth," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "your crime was not treason, but weakness. You saw your brother's murder as a ladder, and did not care that its rungs were slick with blood. You crave a view of the kingdom, you shall have one." She stripped him of his titles and lands, exiling him to the desolate Wyvern Point fortress on the coast. "You will spend your remaining days in its highest tower, with nothing but the endless empty sea for company, a perfect reflection of the power you now hold." Next, Princess Lyra was brought forward, her hysterical rage now replaced by a venomous, broken silence. Ilara looked at the woman who had loved her own brother with a poisonous obsession. "You confused love with possession," Ilara said, her voice softer now, yet somehow colder. And in your selfish passion, you were willing to burn the world. You will be given a lifetime for reflection. Lyra was to be sent to the convent of the Silent Sorrow, a place of stark austerity in the frozen north. You will take a vow of silence. You will not speak, write, or be heard from again. You wanted to be the only voice in your brother's heart. Now you will have only silence for company for all of your days. Finally, Lord Gideon was forced to his knees before her. He stared up at her, not with fear, but with the defiant glare of a master player who had been outmaneuvered. He was searching for a flicker of the weak foreign girl he had planned to discard. He found none. "Lord Gideon," Elara began, rising from her throne to stand over him, "you sought to play the Game of Thrones. You saw us all as your pawns. Your sentence will not be a clean death on the executioner's block. That is a soldier's end. You are a pestilence." Her voice dropped to a chilling whisper that filled the entire hall. "You will be stripped of your name, your lands, your titles. You will be erased from the histories. You will be taken to the Black Moor prison, and you will be thrown into the oubliette, the pit from which no one has ever returned. You craved power and a legacy. Your legacy will be to be forgotten." With the traitors condemned, Elara turned to the stunned council. She was in absolute control. She announced that the Eastern Treaty would proceed, but on new terms, her terms. She elevated Captain Valerius to the position of Lord Commander, his loyalty rewarded. She placed a shaken but resolute Lord Brynmore at the head of her new council. She was not just purging the rot, she was building a new foundation on its ashes. Later that night, in the vast silence of the royal chambers, Elara stood before a mirror. Anya, her loyal lady-in-waiting, carefully brushed the queen's long hair. Elara looked at her own reflection, at the hard lines around her mouth and the ancient weariness in her eyes. The woman who had arrived in this kingdom full of nervous hope was gone forever, burned away in the fires of betrayal. On a velvet cushion beside her rested the king's crown. It was heavy, ornate, and now it was hers. Not by marriage, not by birthright, but by conquest. She picked it up. It was cold to the touch. With slow, deliberate certainty, she raised the crown and placed it firmly upon her own head. It settled, heavy and real. She did not smile. The reflection that stared back was not a wife, not a widow. It was a queen, a survivor, a ruler forged in the heart of a royal deception who had paid an unbearable price for her throne. She paid a terrible price for the truth, but some truths are worth any cost. Her vengeance wasn't about blood, it was about rewriting her own story. What is a truth you would fight for? Let me know in the comments, and if you believe the most powerful stories belong to those who refuse to be silenced, subscribe to the channel.